Welcome to Reformed Thinking, the deep dive where we put away the assumptions, stop skimming the uncomfortable parts of Scripture, and really settle in for a close, focused look at what the text is actually revealing.
It's a great mission. And today, we are tackling a passage that has, I think, generated more speculation than almost any other in the Old Testament. Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4.
Right.
This little section, it's often famous for, questions about giants and angels and strange creatures, but it's not here for that kind of sensational curiosity.
That is the crucial point our source material drives home. I mean, the sons of God and the Nephilim, they so often overshadow the real, sobering theological work this passage is doing. So our mission today is to look past all that mythology and really try to understand why Moses included this specific narrative right before the flood.
We really have to see this passage as a critical piece of literary architecture. It functions as a hinge, that's the key word. It links the hopeful genealogy of Adam's righteous line that came just before it with the catastrophic necessary judgment that immediately follows.
Okay.
The passage is really demanding that we do a deep theological reckoning with sin, with the integrity of a spiritual community, and with the nature of divine judgment itself.
So we need to frame the core narrative problem it's trying to solve. I mean, if we accept that the line of Seth, the worshiping line, was still active, how could the human world move so quickly and so completely to a state of total depravity?
Yeah, how'd it get so bad so fast?
How did the world get so rotten that only Noah and his immediate family were left standing? Our sources show that this whole story in Genesis 6, it hinges on the morality of a covenant people who willingly and tragically abandon their distinctiveness.
That's the heart of the matter.
So let's unpack that. The architectural positioning of this text, Genesis 6.1 to 4, it's not some random insertion. You called it the pivot point, the vital explanation connecting two entirely contrasting states of human existence.
Exactly. To understand the collapse, we first have to understand what was supposed to stand.
And that takes us back to Genesis chapter 5.
We absolutely need the context of Genesis 5. The genealogy, with its recurring solemn refrain, and he died, it reminds you of the pervasive reality of the curse.
Sure, mortality.
The mortality inherited from Adam. However, chapter 5 isn't just a death register. It's tracing the godly line of Seth, the third son born after that catastrophe of Cain killing Abel. This is the line that carries the promise of the woman's seed from Genesis 3.15.
And what was the defining characteristic of this line? What made them distinct?
Their defining characteristic was spiritual allegiance. The narrative notes that it was in the days of Enosh, who was Seth's son, that people began to call upon the name of the Lord.
And what does that mean exactly? Calling on the name of the Lord.
It signifies public, corporate worship. It's a declaration of allegiance. This was the active, visible center of God's saving purposes on earth at that time. They walked with God, as Enoch famously did, and they maintained a spiritual boundary against the rebellious world around them. This Sethite line was really the last bastion of hope for humanity.
The hope is clear then. You can trace God's plan through this preserved spiritual lineage. But then we hit the hinge in 6.1 to 4, and immediately afterward, the entire environment has changed.
Completely changed. In Genesis 6.5 to 7, the verdict is delivered.
And it is a stunning verdict.
It's devastating because it is total. The Lord looks upon the earth and determines that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and crucially, that every intention of his heart was only evil continually.
Only evil continually. That's such an absolute statement.
It is. This is a verdict not just on, surface actions, but on the relentless, uninterrupted malice of the human will. It is the theological justification for total global judgment.
The chasm between the worshiping line of Seth in chapter 5 and this universal evil of chapter 6, verse 5, it's enormous. So that hinge, those 4 verses in 6.1 to 4, has to bridge that moral gap. It has to diagnose the precise mechanism of this total moral collapse.
It has to. The narrative up to this point established 2 distinct humanities after the fall. We have the Cainite line, which is detailed in chapter 4, and it's characterized by self-glorifying culture and violence.
Right, Lamech.
You have Lamech boasting of murder, celebrating arrogance, and founding a culture that was, technically advanced. They had music, metalwork, but it was hostile to God. This was a culture building its own kingdom for its own glory.
And on the other side, you had the Sethite line marked by allegiance and worship.
Exactly. The hinge tells us the two merged. It narrates the tragic, defining moment when that spiritual barrier collapses. The covenant community, the Sethites, the ones who were supposed to be the light, failed because they abandoned their distinctiveness. Instead of marrying within the community of faith, Preserving the godly lineage and confession, they look outward, and they merged with the unbelieving world.
This mixing, then, explains how the corruption became universal. It wasn't an infection from the outside so much as a surrender from the inside.
That's a great way to put it. If the righteous minority loses its identity and merges with the wicked majority, then only wickedness remains. And that justifies the flood as both inevitable and righteous.
When you put it that way, the redemptive historical stakes could not be higher.
They really couldn't. If the Sethite line, the carriers of the promise that leads to the Messiah, is fully absorbed into the self-willed Cainite world, then the entire promise from Eden, Genesis 3.15, is jeopardized.
It's almost extinguished.
Almost. That promise is dependent on the existence of a consecrated, set-apart people. Without them, there's no line for the seed to come from.
So the flood, which on the surface seems so destructive, is actually God acting to preserve his promise.
It is a profound act of preservation. The compromise that's documented in 6.1-4 shows that the promised line itself was on the verge of spiritual extinction through assimilation. The flood is seen, therefore, not as an arbitrary act of vengeance, but as a necessary surgical intervention.
To save the patient.
To preserve the possibility of redemption by isolating Noah, who's the last man found faithful in that line of Seth. It's a tragic story of moral decay, but it's framed by God's unshakable resolve to uphold his covenant.
That makes the narrative flow so much clearer. The focus is entirely on why the human race, promise bearers included, lost its way.
This clarity, however, forces us to address the passage's central interpretive difficulty, the crux interpretum, as it's called.
The sons of God.
Identifying the B'nai Elohim, or sons of God, in Genesis 6.2. The interpretation you choose dictates whether you read this passage as a comment on human failure or as this strange side story about supernatural transgression.
Okay, so we need to evaluate the three primary historical options here and do it neutrally.
Let's do it.
Let's begin with the view that is the most sensational and certainly the most popular in, modern media and speculative literature, the angelic view.
The angelic view. This one claims the sons of God were fallen angels, or spiritual beings, who somehow materialized and took human women as wives, and the result was the Nephilim.
And there is some lexical support for that, right?
There is. Support for this view often points out that in other biblical texts, notably the book of Job, the phrase sons of God undeniably refers to celestial beings, to angels. So this suggests a literal transgression between the spiritual and physical realms led to this unique generation.
And historically, this view has deep roots. It appears even in Second Temple Jewish literature like the Book of 1 Enoch. So why is it rejected by our sources as the primary interpretation of what Moses intended?
Well, there are two main lines of rebuttal. The first is a canonical conflict about the nature of angels. Jesus taught in Matthew 22.30 that angels neither marry nor are given in marriage. Now, some might argue that their fallen nature allows for disobedience to this rule, but the fundamental assumption throughout Scripture is that angels do not possess reproductive capabilities in the way described here. If they could take wives and procreate, it raises some serious theological questions about their nature that the Bible just doesn't support anywhere else.
And the second objection is contextual, isn't it? It sort of distracts from the main argument of Genesis.
Precisely. If Moses' primary purpose was to explain why God judged humanity, focusing on the sins of angels immediately shifts the blame and attention away from human accountability.
Right. Becomes their fault, not ours.
Exactly. The text transitions seamlessly from the marriages in verse 4 to the verdict on human wickedness in verse 5. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great. The narrative flow shows that the true cause of the flood was human depravity, not some peculiar instance of angelology. This view, in the end, it pulls the focus away from the sober practical truths of covenant failure and into really speculative territory.
That makes sense. The passage is justifying God blotting out man, not blotting out a new species of angel hybrid. Okay, so moving on to the second human interpretation, the royal or tyrant view.
The royal view is based on the ancient Near Eastern cultural context. It argues that the sons of God were powerful despotic human rulers or elite families who claimed divine or semi-divine status.
Which was a common thing in that part of the world.
Oh, very common. A common trope in Mesopotamian royal ideology. The sin here is one of tyrannical abuse. They violently seized women, it says they took as their wives any they chose, to consolidate power, turning marriage into a tool of domination. Their offspring, the Nephilim, would be these strong, renowned warlords.
That certainly explains the violence and despotism, which are clear characteristics of the pre-flood world. But what is the main weakness of this view within the context of Genesis itself?
Its primary weakness is that it relies too heavily on concepts of formal political structures, established kingship, royal ideology, that Moses hasn't introduced yet. In the immediate narrative context of Genesis 4 and 5, the defining categories are spiritual and genealogical.
The line of Cain versus the line of Seth.
Right, Moses is tracking covenant fidelity, not political structure. So while the description of tyranny might fit the Nephilim, identifying the Beni Elohim as political rulers doesn't arise organically from the established narrative contrast. It feels a bit like reading later ideas back into the text.
Which brings us to the third view, the covenant or Sethite view, which our sources argue best maintains the textual flow and the covenantal structure of Genesis.
Yes. In the covenant Sethite view, the sons of God are interpreted as human beings, specifically the godly line of Seth.
And why are they called sons of God?
They're called this because they belong to the covenant community, the visible worshiping line that began to call upon the name of the Lord. This is consistent with a broader biblical analogy. God calls Israel his covenant people, his firstborn son. To be a son of God is to be a part of his family by election and allegiance.
So it's a relational, covenantal term.
Precisely.
And if the sons of God are the Sethites, then who are the daughters of man?
The daughters of man represent the broader mass of unredeemed humanity, predominantly the Cainite line, which is defined by its self-willed nature and rebellion. The tension, therefore, is spiritual.
Not just social.
Not just social. The marriages weren't just social mismatches. They represented the crossing of a critical spiritual boundary. The Sethite men, who were charged with preserving the spiritual line, chose wives based on worldly criteria, attractiveness, sight, preference, rather than covenant loyalty and faith.
That coheres perfectly with the narrative that's already been established in chapters 4 and 5. It shows the internal moral failure of the covenant community itself.
It connects all the dots seamlessly. This view confirms that the failure was internal. The godly line became obsessed with the physical and the pleasing, sacrificing spiritual separation for personal desire. And this choice, it dissolved the distinctiveness of the Sethite community, leading to that rapid total corruption that made the flood necessary.
So the judgment was justified because even the keepers of the promise willfully polluted the well of humanity.
That's the tragic conclusion.
But I have to ask the question that I know you, the listener, are thinking right now. If these were just regular, albeit spiritually compromised human beings, why do the resulting offspring, the Nephilim, have such mythological fame and strength? Doesn't the explanation feel a little underwhelming if the consequence is just a generation of strong men?
That is the strongest counter-challenge to this view, and it requires us to clarify the nature of the Gibborim. If we look ahead, the text describes them as mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. We have to resist the urge to translate this as superhuman.
Who are physically giant.
Or physically giant. Instead, we have to interpret it through the lens of moral judgment. The sources highlight that the term Gibborim refers to a moral status, not necessarily physiology. These men embodied the apex of a worldly, self-glorifying culture.
So they weren't necessarily physical giants, but they were moral giants in terms of worldly ambition and power.
Exactly. Their might with their social and political dominance. They were men celebrated for their strength and violence in a culture that valued brute power and fame renown over piety and obedience. Their very existence magnified the world's sin.
Okay, so Moses is emphasizing that the result of the Sethite compromise was not spiritual renewal, but the creation of an even more aggressively wicked, culturally impressive, and militarily dominant society that was completely hostile to God.
And that heightens the justification for the flood. The best of both worlds, so to speak, produced the worst of all worlds.
Having settled that the sons of God were covenant members, we can now turn to the psychology of their downfall. The sources make a really compelling argument that this was not a new or unique sin, but a conscious repetition of the foundational moral failing that happened back in Eden.
It's a masterful piece of literary work by Moses. He deliberately structures the language of Genesis 6.1 to 4 to mirror the pattern that we find in Genesis 3.6.
Why would he do that?
To establish the consistent and cyclical nature of human depravity. We call this the threefold pattern of primal disobedience, and it's always rooted in walking by sight, not by faith.
Okay, let's track that pattern precisely, starting with the sensory initiation.
The first step is initiation by sight, saw. In both Genesis 3 and Genesis 6, the transgression begins with the physical sense overwhelming spiritual restraint. Eve, looking at the forbidden fruit, saw that the tree was good.
And the sons of God?
Likewise, the sons of God in Genesis 6.2 saw that the daughters of man were attractive.
The insight here is crucial because the sources note the specific word choice connects the two events. It's not a coincidence.
It is not. The word translated attractive in 6.2 is the Hebrew word tov, which means good. It is the exact same underlying judgment that Eve made. They looked at what was forbidden, or at least spiritually detrimental, and they judged it to be tov, good, or desirable according to their senses.
So in both cases, spiritual command was instantaneously superseded by visual attraction.
That's it. This highlights that sin isn't always driven by, overt malice. Often it's driven by a faulty aesthetic judgment prioritizing sensory appeal over divine will.
It's the constant temptation, isn't it? The sight, the physical perception of goodness or beauty becomes the governing principle.
It does. And this takes us to the second, internal step, escalation by desire and perception. The sons of God saw the Cainite women and they found them desirable. They prioritized their unrestrained preference, their physical desire, over the spiritual demands of covenant loyalty and the necessity of keeping the line distinct.
This confirms that heartbreaking truth of human nature. Even after God has established a covenant line, even the pious are inwardly vulnerable.
You're seeing the total depravity of the human heart at work. Even those who had the light, who called upon the name of the Lord, chose based on immediate external sensory data. They were governed by the flesh, by what felt right or looked appealing in the moment, rather than by the slow, demanding work of spiritual discernment and allegiance.
So the beauty of the daughters of man became a stumbling block because the sons of God were already inwardly prone to wander.
That's right, and that leads to the culmination, the final decisive action. Number 3, conclusion in self-willed taking.
The pattern completes.
It does. Eve took of its fruit. The sons of God took as their wives any they chose. And that phrase, any they chose, is the defining moral indictment. It just screams self-will.
Right. Not who God chose or who is spiritually suitable.
No, they were not constrained by spiritual obedience or family counsel or the perceived will of God for their lineage. They exercised complete personal autonomy in a matter that had profound covenant-shaping consequences.
They dissolved the spiritual boundary themselves.
Precisely. Moses uses this conscious echo saw, judged it good, and took based on choice, to demonstrate that the compromise was not incidental. It was a failure to live by faith, which requires submitting one's desires and decisions to God's known boundaries. The Sethites, the bearers of the covenant promise, chose to walk by the sight of their eyes, repeating the sin that began humanity's downfall, and in doing so, they infected the entire world system.
This makes the resulting verdict just unavoidable. When the covenant people behave identically to the rebellious people, there's no distinction left and really no defense against the coming judgment.
There's none.
The stage is now set for judgment. But before the flood begins, God speaks a crucial word in Genesis 6.3, and it sets a limit on his interaction with humanity. This brief statement reveals so much about God's justice and his operation of common grace.
The declaration is one of the most theologically dense lines in the chapter. My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. We have to dissect this statement clause by clause to really understand the mechanics of God's justice.
Okay, let's start with the limit on the Spirit's action. My spirit shall not abide in man forever.
This verb, which can be translated as strive or contend or abide, is central to the concept of common grace.
Can you unpack that for us, common grace?
Sure. It tells us that the ongoing restraint of sin in the world is not automatic. It's a deliberate, active, and personal work of God's Spirit. Fallen humanity, if you just leave it to its own devices, would immediately reach the absolute moral low that's predicted in verse 5. But God, through his Spirit, is holding sin back. He's keeping humanity from becoming as evil as it could be.
And God is saying here this striving will not continue indefinitely. He's going to cease this restraining action.
Yes. The phrase is a declaration of judicial intent. God is saying, I will not continue to exert this benevolent restraint on a race that has so thoroughly rejected me. The Spirit's patience has a defined expiration date. And when that Spirit withdraws, the full measure of human wickedness becomes manifest, necessitating immediate judgment.
And the reason given for this cessation of restraint is so powerful, for he is flesh.
The term bashur, or flesh, here is key. It's not just about physicality, meaning because man is a physical being. It's a moral, a theological term. It defines humanity in its fallen state, weak, frail, and enslaved to its base appetites and moral weakness.
So they've chosen to live by sight, by their desires, by their flesh, rather than by the spiritual boundaries he established.
That's it, exactly. God is essentially recognizing that the covenant community failed to live by the Spirit and has joined the world in living by the flesh.
So the Sethites had become bashar.
That's right. Having compromised their spiritual position, they had chosen the path of frailty and corruption, and that necessitates judgment. God sees their state and recognizes that apart from a continued unmerited outpouring of restorative grace, which they have now universally forfeited, no human lineage can preserve itself. The moral status demands separation.
Which leads directly to the specific time frame. His days shall be 120 years.
This is the defined boundary. It sets a divinely appointed period of grace and warning 120 years before the flood's execution.
Now, it's crucial to understand this isn't about human lifespan, right?
Absolutely. This does not announce an immediate reduction of the individual human lifespan. Noah's descendants still lived far longer than 120 years post-flood. Instead, it is a clock on God's patience for the entire world.
A countdown. And during this time, Noah is actively building the ark.
Exactly. The 120 years showcases God's long-suffering character. He doesn't act instantly in wrath. He gives a massive, visible, practical deadline. This period of forbearance serves as a type in redemptive history. Judgment is always preceded by a bounded warning, an opportunity for repentance.
So the flood becomes a foreshadowing of the final judgment.
It does. It reminds every generation that God's patience is real, but it is not infinite.
Let's talk about the culture that arises during this period of limited grace, the culture of the Nephilim. We established they were not necessarily mythological giants, but the Gibborim and the men of renown. What does their existence tell us about this compromised society?
Their existence proves the devastating consequence of a spiritual compromise. These Gibborim were the aggressive, powerful elites. They were celebrated, famous men, men of renown.
That focus on renown seems critical.
It is. It shows a culture obsessed with self-glorification, seeking to make a name for themselves through military dominance, through violence and cultural achievement, completely divorced from God's purposes.
This is in direct contrast to the Sethite ideal of calling on the name of the Lord, which is recognizing God's fame, not their own.
Precisely. The culture that resulted from these mixed marriages exalted power, fame, and reputation over righteousness and humility. The Nephilim were the product of a world where the only success that mattered was worldly success. Their notoriety confirmed the world's comprehensive guilt.
So the verdict in 6.5 that every intention of the heart was evil continually is demonstrated by the fact that even the most celebrated figures in that culture were simply emblems of violence and self-worship.
Yes, the creation of a celebrity culture based on violence and worldly power rounded out the picture of universal depravity, and it made judgment absolutely necessary.
Which brings us to today. Genesis 6 is far more than just a historical record. It's a profound moral warning flare directed at the covenant people of every age, including the church today.
It is. It elevates the spiritual seriousness of marriage and the absolute requirement for corporate holiness and distinctiveness.
The sources position the narrative to focus squarely on the practical implications for those of us living under covenant today. What is the core lesson regarding relationships?
The lesson is rooted in that walking by sight pattern. The Sethites treated marriage as a neutral social arrangement. They chose partners based on a sight physical attraction, worldly desirability, rather than on faith and spiritual allegiance.
They sacrificed covenant loyalty for aesthetic and personal preference.
They did. And the scriptures show this failure pattern doesn't stop in Genesis 6.
No, it's a recurring theme.
It is a recurring tragedy throughout redemptive history. Time and again, mixed marriages between the people of God and those outside the covenant community led directly to idolatry and moral compromise. It eroded the covenant from within. We see it with the Israelites and the Canaanites, with Samson, and catastrophically with Solomon, whose foreign wives turned his heart away from God.
The theological principle is crystal clear. Intimate relationships are never spiritually neutral.
Never. The passage implies and affirms the later New Testament command not to be unequally yoked. Genesis 6 shows that this isn't just optional advice. It is a serious boundary necessary for spiritual survival. A believer who marries an unbeliever is repeating the fundamental sin pattern of the Sethites.
How so?
They're dissolving the spiritual boundary. That union, by its very definition, brings the principles of the ungodly world, the daughters of man, directly into the heart of the covenant family.
So marriage must be reserved for those who share the same allegiance and the same hope.
Absolutely. The covenant allegiance demands that the pursuit of a spouse be governed by faith and obedience, not just by sight and emotion. The consequences of treating marriage as a merely secular choice are generational spiritual decay, as Genesis 6 demonstrates through the Nephilim. The boundary between those who belong to the kingdom and those who belong to the world dissolves the moment the covenant person chooses preference over consecration.
Moving beyond just individual relationships, Genesis 6 delivers a foundational lesson on what you called corporate distinctiveness.
This is perhaps the most searching lesson for the church today. The crisis in Genesis 6 was not merely the level of wickedness outside the camp. The real crisis was that the people of God, the sons of God, ceased to be recognizably different. They became indistinguishable from the world in their choices, their values, and their desires.
And the church faces this same danger when it compromises its standards of faithfulness for the sake of, say, relevance.
It is the exact same snare. The contemporary church is often tempted to adopt the world's metrics of success size, entertainment value, cultural acceptance, financial status, over the biblical standard of faithfulness to doctrine, holiness in life, and reverent worship.
When we pursue those metrics, we are choosing based on sight.
That's right. We're prioritizing what looks good or attractive to the wider culture, rather than choosing by faith in the often unpopular path of obedience.
And this leads to blurred lines where the church can start to look more like a successful social club than a set-apart spiritual body.
And that is the definition of reenacting the sin of Genesis 6. The covenant integrity requires the church to maintain clear, humble, and loyal boundaries. The maintenance of church membership standards, the practice of spiritual discipline, and an uncompromised confession of faith are vital. To blur these lines in the name of accessibility or cultural blending is to repeat the compromise that necessitated the flood. The focus has to be on faithfulness to the Word, not on pleasing the eye of the wider culture.
We must return, then, to the sense of urgency that's established by that 120-year limit.
That time limit is our ultimate theological reality check. Christ himself invoked the days of Noah as the pattern for the time preceding his return.
A time characterized by business as usual.
Exactly. People eating, drinking, marrying, entirely oblivious to the imminent judgment. The world was absorbed in its worldly affairs, walking by sight, assuming that tomorrow would be just like today.
We, too, live in a bounded era of common grace. The clock is ticking for us as well.
We do. The 120 years reminds us that God's patience, while vast, is finite. This has to translate into a compelling urgency for us. A zeal for personal holiness, a seriousness about the spiritual boundaries within marriage, and an urgency in discipleship and proclamation. We have a set time to call people to the refuge before the final day of judgment arrives and the door of refuge closes definitively. Genesis 6 is a powerful argument for the seriousness of the present day.
It really is.
The story of Genesis 6, the failure of the Sethites, it documents the comprehensive inability of humanity to maintain covenant fidelity. It sets up that long, tragic pattern of failure throughout the Old Testament and serves a crucial function. It magnifies the necessity of Christ.
How so?
All the human attempts at being faithful sons of God collapsed. This prepares us for the arrival of Jesus, the true and faithful Son of God, who alone maintained perfect obedience in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. He is the only one capable of preserving a holy people and carrying them through the judgment of wrath, acting as the true and final ark.
So this entire deep dive is a summons to holiness and vigilance. Genesis 6 calls us to examine our own lives. Are we living as set-apart people, or have we allowed the world's values to define our decisions, especially in critical areas like relationships and ambition?
It's a challenging question.
We have to submit our personal desires and our aesthetic preferences to the greater authority of spiritual allegiance. We are continually faced with the choice. Do my choices reflect walking by sight, prioritizing what is appealing to the eye and the flesh, or walking by faith, constrained by God's covenant will?
And finally, reflect on the nature of the wicked society created by that compromise. It resulted in a culture of mighty men and men of renown, people celebrated by the world for their dominance, their strength, and their fame. Consider this sobering application. If the church today seeks to be defined by being mighty and renowned by the world's standards, by adopting worldly metrics of success, influence, and attraction, is it not already repeating the same moral failure, the same prioritizing of the visible and the self-glorifying that ultimately necessitated the first great judgment of the flood? That question should guide how we approach every aspect of Christian living.